Necessity is the birthplace of invention.
Technology is the thing that will win a conflict, and it is developed to answer a specific problem.
And the struggle for victory on the battlefields of the Second World War necessitated an arms race unlike anything humanity had seen before or since.
Wartime is a catalyst for technological development and for change, and that definitely has happened in the Second World War.
Some weapons would never progress past a fanciful idea, a sketch on paper, or a failed test. Others became defining advances in human technology. All represent the ingenious minds and destructive forces born in the chaos of war. These are the secret weapons of World War II. Secrets extended beyond the bombs, armor, and large vessels being developed. Away from the battlefields, espionage and intelligence were crucial to military success.
Each nation has their own technical design bureau so that they could develop their own types of technology. And that was often based upon intelligence, what the other side was doing, what the enemy was doing, and looking at ways in which they could defeat the enemy.
The major players used technology, imagination, and expertise to devise new tools to encrypt, assassinate, and misdirect.
Agents who carried out covert operations needed the tools to be successful. Some of those tools existed, a lot had to be developed, some had to be modified.
New codes, ingenious disguises and decoys, and never-before-seen guns supported the spies, secret agents, and saboteurs. They fought with the covert weapons of war. In 1939, as Germany prepared for war, Hitler demanded all radio communications be protected from enemy eavesdroppers and codebreakers. Nazi codes had to be impenetrable because Hitler planned to rely largely on wireless communications for important military messages. And for that, a single device would be used. A commercially sold German creation known as the Enigma machine.
The story of the Enigma is nothing like you think. The Enigma machine was developed by Arthur Scherbius, a German engineer, during the last years of World War I. And it was produced as a means of encoding messages that governments or large companies might use to send information from one office to another without any chance of it being intercepted. They were bought by governments and companies all over the world, long before Nazism ever arose. But the Germans were simply buying an existing technology. It was not something that the Nazis invented. That's what everybody thinks, and that's simply not the case.
Nazi intelligence officers progressively converted the commercial Enigma into a more complicated military-grade machine. The Enigma consisted of a keyboard with the standard 26 alphabet letters, linked to a lamp board that lit up to reveal the cipher letter. At least 2 people were needed to send an Enigma message. One to type, another to write down the encrypted letters. Typing a letter would push the actuator bar. This completed an electrical circuit, sending a signal to the first of 3 rotors. Each rotor had 26 numbers, with each number corresponding to a letter. The rotors were wired in a complex pattern to further shuffle the signal's pathway within the circuit, before hitting a reflector bar, which returned the signal and re-scrambled the letters on the way back.
Germans added a plug board so that you could increase the complexity of the coding.
The plug board operated like a telephone switchboard, further jumbling the letters. Until finally, this maze illuminated a single letter on the lamp board. To decrypt, the recipient would enter the Morse code into another Enigma machine, which used exactly the same rotor and plugboard settings as the sender had used. The degree of difficulty for codebreakers was mind-boggling. Enigma Mark IV could produce code with 60 septillion possible configurations, or 60 trillion combinations. And the Nazis changed the settings every day in an effort to make it even tougher for the Allies. A key setting manual was distributed to Enigma operators every month, which included daily key codes to be followed by both user and receiver. Different parts of the armed forces had their own cipher networks, with separate key settings for each. It was convoluted and clever, enough permutations and changes to be inviolable. Or so the Germans thought.
The main mistake they made was that they kept sending the same kind of message. And somebody thought, I wonder if that says nothing to report. So they simply tried nothing to report in German, and indeed that turned out to be the case. The other weakness of the Enigma machine is that when it transferred one letter in code to a different letter, the same letter never gave rise to itself. So you automatically knew what letter it wasn't, and that also provided a clue.
The Germans had no idea how their repetitive use of language would help cost them the war, or that teams of brilliant British and Polish cryptanalysts had begun working to combat the Enigma machine before the war had even started. In 1939, the Polish were under no illusions that an invasion by Germany was imminent. But it wasn't just the obvious military build-up along their borders that gave the game away. Before the war in Europe had even officially begun, Germany's supposedly invulnerable Enigma code was already vulnerable. And to aid their decryption process, Polish intelligence had developed a new secret weapon: the bomb.
From 1932, a brilliant young Pole, Marian Rejewski, decided he was going to try and crack the Enigma code. And he worked on it with a team of a couple of friends. And together, they discovered how you could crack Enigma.
Identifying repeated phrases in German messages, Rejewski worked back to replicate the Enigma's wiring without having ever seen the device himself. Then, in 1939, his team delivered a semi-automated decoding machine they called the Bombe.
No one knows why it was named the Bombe, One theory is it was the Bombe cryptologica, which was the cryptological bomb that could blow apart the code. The other reason is that the ice cream bomb was their favorite dessert that they'd go and have when they finished work.
By July 1939, the Bombe had revealed what the world had feared. Hitler was planning to invade Poland.
And realizing that that would mean the end of their enterprise, they got together with the Allies and decided to give their Enigma machine and the computer they had built to decode it to the Allies. And that's how it ended up in Bletchley Park. But it was the Poles who broke the code, not the British.
The codebreakers were based in a country house called Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, about 45 minutes drive from central London. And this was an ideal location because it was away from the public eye. This operation was so top secret. It had to be protected at all costs. And where better than to place it in the heart of the countryside?
Leading the Enigma project at Bletchley Park was a 27-year-old cryptologist named Alan Turing.
When the equipment came to Bletchley Park, Alan Turing was absolutely bowled over by it. The Poles had built a machine that could decode Enigma. But Turing was a brilliant man. He had an extraordinary mathematical brain and a great deal of engineering expertise as well. So they developed a much bigger version of the Bombe.
Turing's supercharged machine, nicknamed the Bombe after its Polish predecessor, was ready for action in the spring of 1940. Turing's new approach used cribs, or small portions of text identified or guessed from an intercepted message. Cribs were fed into the bomb to focus its search for contradictions and matches and throw up possible solutions. But none of this was done sequentially, one rotor at a time, as the Bombe had done. Turing's bomb had multiple sets of rotating drums, simulating the Enigma machine's rotor movement, allowing it to test various combinations simultaneously. It was a major computing milestone that freed up precious manpower and sped up the decryption process dramatically.
And our admiration should go out to the wonderful Alan Turing and his extraordinary team, because as the Nazis made their Enigma machine increasingly complicated, it was Alan Turing's genius that allowed us to keep pace with what was going on.
At its most productive, Bombe was cracking 84,000 Enigma messages per month, decrypting a German message every 30 seconds.
Cracking the Enigma codes actually provided the Allies with an advantage because it meant that we could listen into and decode a number of messages going between the enemy commands.
The Bombe regularly revealed Axis plans to attack the British, giving them time to act. But they relied so heavily on this intelligence, they couldn't risk the Germans learning of it. On the night of November 14th, 1940, the West Midlands city of Coventry was the target of a German air raid. Over 11 hours, 500 Luftwaffe bombers blitzed the civilian center, wiping out 1/3 of the city's houses and leaving more than 550 people dead. It was the single most concentrated attack on a British city during the war. But did the British know it was coming?
It was absolutely essential to keep the fact that we'd cracked the Enigma codes totally secret. We had advanced intelligence from those Enigma codes, Enigma messages, that Coventry was going to be heavily bombed. But if we protected Coventry, the Germans would suspect that we had broken the Enigma codes. So it led occasionally to very difficult decisions by intelligence commanders.
Historians still debate whether British officials knew precise details of the Coventry bombings in advance. But it is accepted sacrifices were made on occasion to throw the enemy off and prevent them from further complicating the code.
The fact that we could follow what the Nazis were up to was crucial. Basically speaking, it meant that we knew what Germany was up to. And that must have had a massive effect on saving lives, on limiting damage, and on shortening the duration of the war.
Over the course of the war, British manufacturing company BTM built approximately 210 bombs. It's conservatively estimated that Turing's coding shortened the war by 2 to 3 years and saved up to 20 million lives.
The team at Bletchley Park, under the inspirational genius of Turing, performed a service that we will never fully be able to understand. But it's a service to which we owe so much in the modern world.
As nations waged a large-scale shadow war of information, secret weapons were also being developed for small-scale clandestine operations. Following the Nazi occupation of Poland, many disparate resistance groups across the country formed the Armia Krajowa, or the Home Army. At its height, the Home Army was over 300,000 strong. But despite the manpower, firepower was lacking. Many partisans armed only with knives or clubs. In 1942, the Allies began development of a weapon that could be mass-produced in the hopes of arming partisan groups like the Armia Krajowa in occupied countries. The result was the FP-45 Liberator.
It was designed in America on behalf of the American intelligence community, not OSS, which is the American equivalent of the Special Operations Executive in the UK. They were asking for a weapon which could be designed in large quantities to what's referred to in the Second World War as patriots, or patriot forces, slightly different from agents. Now, the word FP45 is actually a code word. It actually stands for Flare Pistol 45, but it also had a number of other names which it was called by. One was the Liberator, which is what the name that most people associate with it. The other one was the Woolworth gun, because it was so cheap to make.
The gun was developed and mass-produced by American car manufacturer General Motors, which used its own auto parts fabrication method known as steel stamping. This casting technique took sheets of metal and formed usable shapes, perfect for efficiently pumping out the 23 parts needed for the pistol. The design was quick and basic. A 10-centimetre barrel shot a single .45 caliber bullet at a time. 5 spares were stored in the handle. To reload, a user needed to first push the supplied piece of dowel in to pop out the shell. The cocking tab retracted and turned sideways. The breech cover slid up, the new shell inserted, and the cover put back into position. Finally, the charging tab was rotated to line up with the barrel.
So a contract was let in early 1942. It was let to General Motors, the guide lamp division of General Motors, to be precise.
This top-secret project involved 300 workers toiling 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's estimated each pistol took just over 6 seconds to make and cost little more than $2 apiece, about $35 in today's money. In approximately 10 to 11 weeks, they had produced 1 million Liberators.
It was a very cheaply produced, and therefore it was disposable. It would actually fire the projectile through an unrifled barrel. So having a smoothbore gun is actually a cheaper way of making the weapon system. So with the Liberator, the drawback means that it was not very accurate at all.
With accuracy in question, General Eisenhower thought it a waste of precious military resources to airdrop vast quantities across Europe. General MacArthur, though, sent around 50,000 to arm guerrillas throughout the Pacific, including 8,000 villages in the Solomon Islands. After that, the remaining FP-45s were earmarked for destruction. Trashing so many weapons seemed a terrible loss to the Office of Strategic Services, which salvaged and redirected hundreds of thousands of the pistols. A few 100,000 were delivered by submarine, and others airdropped to Axis-occupied territories, the majority landing in Burma, India, China, and the Pacific. But evidence of the Liberator's use in action is patchy.
One of the interesting things about the Liberator, stroke FP-45, is its intended purpose. It was intended really as an emergency supply pistol capable of shooting occupiers at very close range. In fact, it's not designed really to be used beyond 15 meters because its accuracy degrades dramatically beyond that.
This fast-track pistol was only ever intended to disarm an enemy and take a better weapon. A gun made to get a gun. Other guns were more advanced, designed for undercover operatives and special forces infiltrators. By 1942, a new espionage facility was operating in the town of Welland, north of London. Known as Station 9, it was a research and development arm of the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE, the intelligence agency commissioned by Winston Churchill in 1940. And one of the top secret items on the drawing board at Station 9, a concealable and silent weapon to take out Nazi soldiers, officials, and sympathizers. the well rod.
SOE had already identified a need for silence, and silence in firearms is quite useful in certain circumstances. Also, combined operations, then under the command of Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, requested a silent pistol to take out sentries or guards, certainly when they're conducting what's called coup de main operations on the shores of Europe.
The well rod gun first hit the production line in 1943. Its long, tubular shape was intentionally designed not to look like a pistol, allowing the weapon to easily blend in a toolbox or hopefully be mistaken for a bicycle pump. Single shot and manually operated, the well rod had an 8-round magazine capacity. In the field, it reloaded with reasonable ease, much like a bolt-action rifle. The operating handle twisted 90 degrees, pulling back to open the breech and ejecting the spent round. The breech handle was pushed forward again, loading a new cartridge, and simultaneously cocked the firing pin before returning to lock the breech. A quick depress of the safety grip and the pistol fired again.
So it is concealable, it is usable, but it is single shot. It is only designed really to be used within a sort of a 25-meter range.
In a typical pistol, the bullet is propelled by burning gases which expand and create a sonic blast on exit. The well rod used low-velocity bullets, which removed the sound of the bullet breaking the sound barrier. But this reduced velocity also reduced its effective range. Despite its limitations, well rods were eventually dispatched to operatives from Denmark to Yugoslavia, Manchuria to France. Many were used to kill bridge and railway guards during sabotage missions and to covertly assassinate SS officers, Gestapo officials, and collaborators. It remains the quietest suppressed weapon developed during the war. Its blast measuring a mere 73 decibels, marginally louder than a vacuum cleaner. It was so quiet, a French resistance member was able to assassinate an informer in a crowded bar and escape unnoticed.
Now, most pistols in themselves, when they're fitted with suppressors, they're rarely silent. The well rod, on the other hand, was very quiet indeed. And this was down to the way that it was made.
Ordinary suppressors reduce the velocity of the gases and the bullet and use internal baffles to muffle the sound. But the well rod's silencing went further.
It had a number of what we call wipes, which was effectively little discs of rubber which was fitted into barrels. And your first shot of the well rod would actually pierce a series of these rubber discs. And because it was rubber, it would close up behind the projectile, and that would trap the sound to a certain extent. The other factor that helps reduce the noise of the weapon system is the fact that it fired a subsonic projectile. So you don't get that supersonic crack when the projectile leaves the gun barrel. In doing so, it was able to keep the noise of the weapon system down, which is perfect for clandestine operations of the James Bond type and that type of thing.
Quiet, concealable, and simple to operate, the well rod pistol became a valuable tool in the hands of Allied secret operatives across many territories.
By the end of the war, we believe that up to maybe 11,000 had been issued around the world, and we know that they saw service in the European theatre, the Mediterranean theatre, the Far East theatre, Southwest Pacific area, and indeed the Americans had some. So it is quite an iconic weapon of World War II.
As secret operatives were taking out high-value targets and causing chaos behind enemy lines, another secret concealable weapon was helping Allied soldiers in the event of capture by the enemy. On the morning of August the 7th, 1942, 16,000 US Marines landed on the Solomon Islands, marking the beginning of the reconquest of the Pacific. Fighting in this theatre was unlike any others. Dense jungles and an enemy expert in camouflage and infiltration tactics made front lines volatile. The Allies wanted a weapon that could be deployed in close quarters fighting and be covertly concealed in the event of capture by the enemy, leading to one of the war's most curious secret weapons. The Sedgley OSS-38 glove gun.
The Sedgley gun, or the fist gun, very exotic item, very unusual, very few still exist. It was designed in America, probably for the US Navy, more specifically for what's referred to as the Seabees, which is the construction battalions of the US Navy. When they're out and about building things like airfields on islands in the Pacific, you're operating some large piece of machinery. Obviously, you can't have a rifle with you, so maybe you have a glove.
On islands the Americans considered safe territory, Japanese infiltrators would hide in caves and jungles, launching surprise attacks on bases and personnel. In the event of such an attack, hand-to-hand fighting was common, and a wearable gun could have been a valuable resource.
It comprised of a glove, as the name implies, and on top of that glove was riveted a contraption which included a barrel and a plunger. Now, the plunger was there so that when the individual would make a fist, it would keep the knuckles and the fingers away from the tube that was on top of the glove gun. And so that individual could actually punch their target, and in doing so, it would compress the plunger and activate the firing mechanism, release the firing pin into the primer, and then fire a projectile into the intended target.
Reloading was time-consuming, though. The user released a catch, and the barrel pivoted to eject the spent round. But a new .38 caliber bullet had to be loaded, carefully, by hand. Designed as a weapon of last resort, the Sedgley was also supplied to beach jumpers. Small decoy units that faked amphibious landings, and to naval units in the Pacific. If taken prisoner, a commando with his hands above his head could strike a passing captor and kill him with a single bullet-propelled punch.
Even though it was a fantastic idea, it really wasn't that useful. Mainly because that many soldiers rarely found themselves in a position where they could use it, that they were actually wearing it at the time when they met their enemy. So perhaps it may have been useful for some clandestine, sort of spy-based application, but in reality, for the common troop, it really wasn't that useful.
Although the US Office of Strategic Services believed the glove gun would help troops in North Africa and Asia and support anti-Japanese guerrillas throughout China and Burma, it's unclear whether any were dispatched to them. It's estimated that as few as 55 to a maximum of 200 Sedgley guns were ever produced. As agents, partisans, and special forces units were armed with covert secret weapons of war, other weapons utilized the magic of Hollywood to misdirect, conceal, and camouflage. Following Japan's surprise bombing of the US naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America's Pacific seaboard was gripped by panic. Japan was too close and too threatening. Infrastructure and manufacturing plants needed to be protected, and sometimes even hidden. One such factory would come to be affectionately known as Boeing Wonderland. Boeing Plant 2 was an aircraft factory built in Seattle in the mid-1930s. By 1941, Plant 2 was manufacturing B-17 Flying Fortresses and A-20 Havoc light bombers for the US.
In the wake of Pearl Harbor, there was a real fear that Japanese G4Ms, which were twin-engine small bombers, would actually be able to reach the West Coast and bomb the factories. And so there was a very real concern that they could cause severe damage to aircraft factories in particular that would slow down production.
General John DeWitt of the 4th Army was charged with turning his attention to the defense of US soil and citizens and the country's plane production. So DeWitt recruited an engineer who came up with a visionary camouflage proposal for the coast's aircraft factories.
And the idea was to make these aircraft factories disappear by cloaking them to appear like innocuous suburban areas, and it would appear that way from aircraft that were flying only at 5,000 feet.
To make this happen, help was sought from the experts in the art of make-believe, Hollywood itself.
He approached set designers and large-scale scenic painters from the major studios, in particular Disney, MGM, and Paramount, who were all eager to help with the war effort.
A giant theatrical set was built, camouflaging the entire Boeing plant.
It was a bold plan that included a rooftop covering for the factory on which they built a neighborhood. And this construction included painting streets and foliage on the airfield itself, as well as on top of the factory. They started the streets in this neighborhood atop the factory. They constructed onto the airfield and beyond. There were 3 major streets. There were driveways. They constructed 53 homes, 2 of which were occupied. There was a store, there was a gas station. And all of these things combined to create the illusion that there was a neighborhood where the plant actually existed.
It was a monumental feat of creativity and construction, with burlap, chicken wire, and canvas holding everything together. Building over the more than 213,000 square metre plant took 152,400 metres of support wires and 500 tonnes of steel. Hired actors walked around 36 metres of dummy streets. past 9,100 square metres of concrete mini-houses and paths, and the airstrip runways were faked, with nearly 78,000 metres of camouflage texturing.
The Seattle Daily Times nicknamed this fictitious neighborhood as the Boeing Wonderland.
And this wasn't the only time that the Allies turned to Hollywood for help with developing covert weapons. In one case, there was a whole unit devoted to the art of deception. As the war dragged into its fourth year, the Allies were immersed in D-Day planning, plotting to push back into Nazi strongholds throughout Europe via the French beaches of Normandy. But prior to the Normandy landing, the Allies initiated a critical diversion, a mission of novel secret weapons and tactical deception called Operation Bodyguard. And at its core, a mysterious PSYOPs team that took wartime trickery to a completely new level. Dubbed the Ghost Army.
The Allies had an extensive strategic deception plan for the D-Day operation. The larger plan was called Operation Bodyguard, and it had multiple parts. And the purpose of those parts was twofold: to tie down the Germans in specific parts of Europe, and then also to prevent them from transporting troops and tanks and other resources to Normandy once the invasion started. But of all the parts of Operation Bodyguard, there was one aspect that most directly affected the Normandy invasion, and that was Operation Fortitude.
Fortitude was based on the premise that Germany knew a cross-channel invasion was inevitable. It was a two-part maneuver, designed to draw the Nazis' attention away from the real target, the beaches of Normandy. Fortitude North was a bluff to convince Hitler the Allies would enter the continent via Norway. Fortitude South, however, drew the enemy's focus to the port town of Dover.
The Germans had the preconceived idea that the logical place for the Allies to invade was the Pas-de-Calais region, because that was the shortest part of the channel, and so that was the obvious invasion site. And what Fortitude South did was reinforce that idea and focus the German attention even more so on the Pas-de-Calais at the expense of them looking at Normandy.
Executing these deceptions was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a small brigade of 1,100 artists, designers, and sound engineers. They would use Hollywood-style smoke and mirrors to create the illusion of large-scale military activity to bamboozle the enemy.
They did these camps by providing what looked like troop concentrations, vehicle parks, guns, tanks, and all the other things that they needed to suggest the massing of forces in a particular area. Another thing that they did was they recorded the sound of vehicles moving. And they would play those recordings at night, and it would give the impression that there was constant movement in the camps, vehicles coming in, delivering supplies and troops, vehicles leaving.
With 3 separate units, each assigned to produce either audio, visual, or radio fakes, the Ghost Army was so effective, its 1,100 men could impersonate a full division of 30,000 soldiers.
One of the problems in creating these decoy weapon and vehicle displays is making them realistic. And the British would actually fly reconnaissance flights over some of these displays to see how realistic they were. And then they would take that information and go back and modify some of these displays. They actually had smoke billowing out of dummy funnels that were on these landing craft. They had oil slicks in the water around them. They put up laundry that would flap in the wind, and they would have crews going from landing craft to landing craft delivering mail and other supplies. So they created this illusion in which there was actually real activity.
A mock airfield hosted wooden twin engines and Spitfires, fabric gliders and landing craft made of steel and painted canvas. Ever present, though, was a risk that the exposed inflatable tanks or weapons would come under enemy attack themselves. So they were constructed of a web of air-filled tubes, all reinforced with rubberized canvas, structures very unlikely to deflate quickly if pierced.
And so they did all sorts of things in order to enhance that realism. And then they would also play recordings that suggested that the troops in those camps were engaged in embarkation and debarkation exercises in preparation for the invasion.
News of this buzzing Dover camp was purposely leaked to the enemy through a network of double agents, which Axis signal operators confirmed when they heard the bogus radio chatter generated by the Ghost Army. This delicate tapestry of misdirection all gave credence to the idea that the invasion was aimed at the Pas-de-Calais region. On June 5th and 6th, 1944, the Ghost Army pulled off an incredible sleight of hand. A false landing that looked every bit authentic. To the east and west of the Normandy invasion target, 400 dummy soldiers, Hessian bodies stuffed with sand and straw, were parachuted into the water and onto the beaches. A select number carried loudspeakers, playing the sounds of gunfire and bombs. Some intentionally exploded on impact. The Rupert diversion further confused the Axis enemy, forcing the Germans to choose where to send their available men. And as the Nazis considered the options, D-Day itself was being played out, with 18,000 Allied and armed paratroopers dropping from the skies over Normandy for the real landing. The Allies had hoped that Operation Bodyguard would gain them just 2 weeks' grace. But despite reservations, Hitler declared Normandy the feint and kept the bulk of the Wehrmacht away for at least 7 weeks. That was all the time the Allies needed. By the time the war ended almost a year later, the Ghost Army would be credited with saving the lives of up to 30,000 men. From bogus Boeing factories to glove guns and clever code cracking, World War II was as much a conflict of camouflage and espionage as it was hard-fought battles in the field. For the Allies, some tactics paid off better than others, but without the technology and ingenuity of the engineers, cryptologists and artists, the builders, actors and commanders, successful subterfuge would not have been possible. Because during a war, the secrets a side can keep are weapons in themselves. And for the Allies, those secret weapons helped win the war.